Story 1.
It was supposed to be a weekend escape from the relentless hum of daily life. The forests of Oklahoma had always been a sanctuary for me, a place where I could lose myself in the tranquil embrace of nature. As I set up my tent under the dappled light filtering through the trees, I felt a deep sense of peace. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I relished the solitude, believing this camping trip would be a perfect retreat from the world's chaos. The serene silence of the woods was abruptly shattered as I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite while hiking. Old backpacks lay strewn across the ground, their contents scattered in disarray. Torn tents flapped listlessly in the breeze, their fabric worn and faded. It was a scene of neglect and disorder, but what struck me most was the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over the area. There was no sign of recent activity, no trace of the people who had once occupied this space. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured closer. As I approached the center of the campsite, my heart began to race. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating. Then I saw them, people, or what used to be people. Their faces were grotesquely contorted, their movements erratic and unnatural. They shuffled around aimlessly, their eyes vacant and soulless. It was as though their bodies had been overtaken by something malevolent and alien. I froze in terror, my instincts screaming at me to flee. I glanced around, searching for a place to hide. The forest seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. I slipped behind a cluster of trees, trying to steady my breathing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath my feet seemed to echo through the stillness, betraying my presence. From my hiding spot, I watched as the twisted figures moved closer. Their voices were a jarring cacophony of hisses and growls, mingled with incoherent mutterings. It was as if they were speaking in a language that defied understanding, a dark and twisted parody of human speech. The fear that gripped me was visceral, almost tangible. I knew I had to find a way out before they noticed me. The forest around me began to shift and warp. The trees seemed to lean inwards, their branches stretching like gnarled fingers. I could hear whispers on the wind, faint and disjointed. The familiar path I had taken seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a labyrinth of darkened trails and ominous shadows. My mind raced as I tried to remember the way back to my campsite, but everything felt distorted and alien. As night fell, the forest took on an even more sinister quality. The darkness was thick and oppressive, swallowing every trace of light. The strange figures seemed to become more agitated, their movements more frantic. I could hear them coming closer, their hissing voices growing louder. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a trap closing in on me. Desperation fueled my movements as I stumbled through the underbrush, every step a battle against the encroaching darkness. The sounds of the creatures grew closer, their footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. I could see their shadowy forms flitting between the trees, their grotesque faces illuminated only by the faintest glimmer of moonlight. I knew I had to keep moving, but my legs felt like lead, and every breath I took was a ragged gasp. The forest seemed to conspire against me, the paths twisting and turning in impossible ways. Every turn I took led me deeper into the unknown. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. I was lost, and the realization only added to the suffocating dread that enveloped me. With every step I took, the forest seemed to mock my efforts to escape. The once familiar terrain had become a nightmarish maze, and I struggled to keep my bearings. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rot, and the whispers on the wind grew more insistent, more urgent. I could almost feel the presence of something watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. The figures from the abandoned campsite were never far behind. Their hissing voices echoed through the trees, a constant reminder of their pursuit. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their movements growing more frenzied. I tried to stay calm, focusing on finding any signs of civilization, but the forest seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the batteries, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When the light finally came back on, I was met with a sight that filled me with utter horror. The creatures were close now, their twisted faces visible in the beam of my flashlight. I could see their eyes, dark and empty, locked onto me with a predatory gaze. I ran blindly, my mind consumed by the primal instinct to survive. The forest had become a nightmarish realm, every shadow and sound a potential threat. My only goal was to reach the safety of the outside world, but with each passing moment, I felt the odds slipping away. The creatures were relentless, their pursuit unwavering. The terrain grew rougher, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they were giving out. I could hear the creatures gaining on me, their hissing voices growing louder with each step. Panic surged through me as I realized that I might not make it out alive. In the distance, I saw a faint light. It was a beacon of hope, a sign that I might be near the edge of the forest. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. The light grew brighter, and I felt a surge of relief. But just as I thought I was safe, the forest erupted into chaos once again. The light I had seen turned out to be a cruel illusion. As I drew closer, I realized it was nothing more than a reflection of the moonlight on a twisted, gnarled tree. My heart sank as I stumbled back into the darkness, the creatures still hot on my trail. I could hear their hissing voices growing louder, their footsteps almost upon me. Desperation drove me to keep moving, even as my strength waned. I could feel the forest closing in around me, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every sound seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I had lost all sense of direction, and the fear of being lost forever was almost more than I could bear. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed something strange, a flicker of light in the distance. It was a small, faint glow, like a distant campfire. I knew it was my only chance for survival. With what little energy I had left, I made my way towards the light, hoping against hope that it would lead me to safety. The light grew stronger as I approached, and I could see that it was coming from an old, dilapidated cabin. My heart leapt with hope, and I rushed towards it, praying that someone might be inside. As I reached the cabin, I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with the possibility that it might be a trap. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, with old furniture covered in layers of dust. I fumbled for a light switch, finally managing to turn on a dim lamp. The cabin seemed deserted, but I could feel an unsettling presence lingering in the air. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The sound of movement outside made me jump. I peered through the window, and to my horror, I saw the twisted figures approaching the cabin. They moved with a disjointed grace, their grotesque faces illuminated by the dim light. I knew I had to act quickly. I grabbed a rusty shovel from the corner and prepared to defend myself, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures outside seemed to sense my presence, their movements becoming more frantic. I could hear their hissing voices growing louder, their fingers scratching at the cabin walls. I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way to escape. Suddenly, the door to the cabin burst open, and the figures surged inside. I swung the shovel with all my strength, trying to fend them off. The impact felt like hitting a wall of flesh, and the creatures barely flinched. Their eyes locked onto me with a predatory hunger, and I could see the madness in their gaze. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a mirror hanging on the wall. The reflections of the creatures were distorted and warped, their faces twisted into nightmarish shapes. It was as if the mirror was showing a glimpse of a reality beyond my understanding. The sight was almost too much to bear, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. As the figures closed in on me, I felt a surge of panic and adrenaline. I fought with everything I had, but it seemed like a losing battle. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, their strength beyond anything human. I could feel their hands grabbing at me, their breath hot and rancid against my skin. Just as I was about to be overwhelmed, a sudden explosion of light filled the cabin. The figures recoiled, their twisted forms writhing and contorting in response. I turned to see the source of the light, a lantern on a nearby table, its flame burning brightly. The creatures seemed to be repelled by the light, their hissing voices growing fainter. Seizing the opportunity, I grabbed the lantern and made a desperate dash for the door. I burst outside, the light cutting through the darkness and pushing the creatures back. My escape was fraught with danger, but the light gave me a slim chance of survival. The forest seemed even more menacing in the glow of the lantern. The twisted figures were still pursuing me, their movements erratic and relentless. I could hear their hissing voices growing louder as I ran, my legs aching with every step. The light from the lantern provided a small measure of safety, but it was not enough to fully dispel the darkness. I made my way through the forest, desperately trying to find a path back to civilization. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me. In the distance, I saw a faint light, a sign that I might be nearing the edge of the forest. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The lantern's light flickered, but I kept moving, driven by the hope that I was close to safety. As I approached the edge of the forest, the terrain grew more familiar. I could see the outlines of distant buildings, a sign that civilization was near. My hope surged, but I was not out of danger yet. The creatures were still pursuing me, their hissing voices echoing through the trees. The forest path seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I could feel my strength waning. The lantern's light flickered and dimmed, and I knew I had to reach safety before it went out completely. I pushed myself to keep moving, driven by the fear of what awaited me if I failed. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing. The sight of a small cabin in the distance filled me with a mixture of relief and dread. I could see the lights of the cabin shining through the windows, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I made my way towards it, praying that it would offer sanctuary from the horrors of the forest. As I reached the cabin, I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows dark and empty. I could hear the creatures drawing closer, their hissing voices growing louder. I knew I had to act quickly. I forced open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, but it seemed empty. I searched the cabin for anything that could help me, food, water, anything that might give me a chance to survive. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness. In the distance, I could hear the creatures outside, their footsteps growing louder. I knew I had to find a way to defend myself. I rummaged through the cabin, finding an old hunting rifle and some ammunition. I had no idea if it would be effective against the creatures, but it was my only option. As the creatures drew closer, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. The old rifle felt heavy and unwieldy in my hands, but it was a weapon, and that was all that mattered. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, as I heard the scratching and hissing outside the cabin. The door burst open, and the figures surged inside. I raised the rifle and fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the small cabin. The creatures recoiled, their twisted forms writhing and contorting. The light from the rifle's muzzle flash illuminated their grotesque faces, revealing the full extent of their horror. Despite my efforts, the creatures seemed to be unaffected by the rifle. They continued to advance, their movements growing more frantic. I could feel the weight of despair pressing down on me, and I knew that my situation was becoming increasingly dire. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from a hidden corner of the cabin, I made my way towards it, hoping it might provide a clue to my escape. The glow led me to a small, ancient-looking book lying on a dusty shelf. The book's cover was adorned with strange symbols and markings. I opened it, and the pages were filled with cryptic text and illustrations of dark rituals. As I scanned the pages, I realized that the book might hold the key to understanding the creatures and their weaknesses. With a sense of grim determination, I began to decipher the text. The book described a ritual that could repel the creatures, but it required specific ingredients and precise incantations. I had neither, but I knew I had to try something. I gathered the few items I could find in the cabin and began to perform the ritual. As I began the ritual, I could feel the creatures outside growing more agitated. Their hissing voices grew louder, and their scratching at the cabin walls became more frantic. I struggled to focus on the ritual, my hands shaking with fear and exhaustion. The ritual was complex and demanding, but I pushed through, reciting the incantations as best as I could. The room was filled with a strange energy, and I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The creatures outside seemed to be repelled by the ritual, their movements becoming more erratic and disorganized. Despite my efforts, the ritual was not a complete success. The creatures continued to attack the cabin, their persistence unrelenting. I knew I had to find another way to escape before the ritual lost its effectiveness. As the night wore on, I could feel the cabin growing colder. The temperature seemed to drop, and the air was filled with an oppressive chill. The creatures outside were becoming more desperate, their attacks more violent. I knew that time was running out, and I had to find a way to escape. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the old rifle and the ammunition I had found. I knew I had to use it to create a distraction, to buy myself some time. I set up the rifle near the door and prepared to fire it, hoping it would draw the creatures away from the cabin. When the creatures finally broke through the door, I fired the rifle, the sound echoing through the night. The creatures recoiled, their twisted forms writhing and contorting. I took advantage of the distraction to slip out the back of the cabin, hoping to find a way out of the forest. The forest was even darker now, the trees pressing in on me as I stumbled through the underbrush. The creatures were still pursuing me, their hissing voices growing louder. I could hear their footsteps crunching through the leaves, and I knew I had to keep moving. Despite my exhaustion, I pushed forward, driven by the hope of finding safety. The forest seemed to shift and change around me, the path growing more treacherous with each step. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, and my sense of direction was all but gone. In the distance, I saw a faint light, a sign that I might be near the edge of the forest. With renewed determination, I made my way towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. The light grew brighter, and I could see the outlines of buildings in the distance. As I reached the edge of the forest, I saw a small town in the distance. The sight of civilization filled me with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I staggered towards the town, my legs feeling like lead. The creatures were still pursuing me, their hissing voices echoing through the trees. I reached the outskirts of the town, and the lights of the buildings seemed like a beacon of hope. I made my way to the nearest house and pounded on the door, my heart racing with fear. The door opened, and I was greeted by a concerned-looking woman. I collapsed on the doorstep, gasping for breath. The woman called for help, and soon I was surrounded by medical professionals and law enforcement. They listened to my story with a mixture of skepticism and concern, but I knew that I had finally escaped the horrors of the forest. As I recovered in the safety of the town, I could not shake the memories of the forest and the twisted figures that had pursued me. The experience had left me scarred, both physically and mentally. I knew that I would never be the same, and the fear of what I had encountered would haunt me forever. The authorities investigated the abandoned campsite in the forest, but they found no trace of the creatures or the people who had once occupied the area. The forest remained as mysterious and unsettling as ever, a place where the darkness held secrets that were best left unexplored. Despite the safety of the town, I found it difficult to sleep. Every sound in the night brought back memories of the hissing voices and the grotesque figures. I knew that I had survived a nightmare, but the scars of that night would remain with me forever. As I moved forward with my life, I became a cautionary tale for others who ventured into the forest. The story of my encounter with the twisted figures served as a warning to those who sought to explore the dark and hidden corners of the world. I hoped that my experience would keep others safe, even as it left me with a lingering sense of dread. The forest of Oklahoma remained a place of mystery and fear, a testament to the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface. My escape from that nightmarish place was a victory, but the horrors I had witnessed would never truly be forgotten. The forest had claimed a part of me, and the echoes of that night would continue to haunt my dreams.
Story 2.
The forest in Montana was nothing like the sprawling city I had left behind. As I set up my tent, the sheer silence was both unnerving and calming. I could hear the rustle of leaves as a gentle breeze passed through the trees, and the air was crisp and refreshing. It seemed like the perfect escape from the chaotic hum of urban life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced with the flickering flames of my campfire. Everything felt serene, almost too perfect. By the time night fully arrived, the temperature dropped, and a dense fog began to roll in. The firelight created eerie, shifting patterns on the forest floor, and I could barely make out the silhouettes of the trees. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest began to change. There were subtle, rhythmic thuds that seemed to come from deep within the woods. At first, I dismissed them as the sounds of animals, but something about them felt wrong. The noises grew louder, and a chilling shiver ran down my spine. It was as if someone or something was deliberately trying to disturb the silence. I heard a faint whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible, but it was clear enough to feel like it was directed at me. The whisper seemed to beckon me, a subtle invitation to leave the safety of my camp and venture into the darkness. I tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to the isolation and the strange acoustics of the forest. Sleep evaded me that night. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves felt amplified in the oppressive darkness. The sounds continued, growing more distinct and rhythmic. It was as if someone was walking in slow, deliberate steps around my camp, stopping only to create a sense of dread. I lay still in my tent, trying to convince myself that it was merely the forest settling in for the night. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, my nerves frayed from the night's events. The forest looked different in the daylight, somehow more oppressive. I noticed strange tracks near my camp, barely visible in the undergrowth but unmistakably human. The tracks led deeper into the woods, twisting and turning in a manner that seemed unnatural. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I decided to follow them, hoping to find a rational explanation. The tracks led me to a small clearing where I stumbled upon an old, wooden cross. It was weathered and broken, with what looked like dried blood smeared across its surface. Around it were various personal belongings, clothing, a tattered book, and other items that seemed to tell a story of someone who had once sought refuge in this very place. My heart pounded as I realized that these items were not just remnants of a forgotten camper but possibly evidence of something much darker. The realization that I might not be alone in the forest filled me with a growing sense of dread. I began to feel like I was being watched, a sensation that grew more intense with each passing minute. The whispering continued, more insistent now, as if urging me to uncover some hidden truth or face whatever lurked in the darkness. I tried to rationalize everything, but the feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. The sun began to set again, and I decided to return to my camp, my mind racing with fears of what I had found. The forest was no longer the tranquil escape I had envisioned. It had become a labyrinth of shadows and unease. I packed my belongings with trembling hands, determined to leave before nightfall. But as I prepared to leave, the noises started again, closer this time, almost as if they were right beside me. Panic surged through me as I realized that escaping might not be as simple as packing up and leaving. The sounds were no longer distant, they were around me, surrounding me. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out a more coherent voice, pleading or perhaps warning. I glanced back at the cross, now almost hidden by the encroaching darkness, and felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Desperation drove me to make a decision. I had to find a way out of the forest before it was too late. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to follow the path I had taken earlier, hoping to retrace my steps. But the forest seemed to have changed. The once familiar path was now a maze of trees and shadows. The whispers had turned into an almost audible chant, a haunting melody that seemed to guide me deeper into the forest rather than towards safety. The flashlight's beam flickered as the forest grew darker, and I could barely make out the outlines of the trees. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in on me, and every rustle of the leaves or snap of a twig felt like a threat. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my sense of direction completely disoriented. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost feel the breath of whatever was pursuing me. In my frantic state, I tripped and fell, landing face first in the dirt. As I looked up, I saw a figure standing among the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, knowing that whatever it was not a friendly presence. I sprinted through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush. The figure seemed to follow me, its presence an ever-present shadow in the periphery of my vision. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their tones a mix of anger and sorrow. The once comforting sounds of the forest now felt like a trap, a cruel mockery of safety. The path I had followed earlier seemed to vanish, replaced by a tangle of trees and brambles. I felt a surge of panic as I realized I was completely lost. The forest had become an alien landscape, shifting and changing with each step I took. The figure was still behind me, its footsteps a rhythmic reminder of my impending doom. I came across a small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls rotting and collapsing. Desperation drove me to seek refuge inside, hoping it might provide some protection from whatever was pursuing me. As I entered the cabin, the door creaked ominously, and I could hear the sound of the whispers growing louder, as if the cabin itself was alive with malevolent energy. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust and decay. The furniture was covered in cobwebs, and the floorboards creaked with every step. I tried to barricade the door with a broken table, but the whispers outside seemed to grow even more intense. The darkness inside the cabin was almost absolute, the only light coming from the dim beam of my flashlight. As I searched the cabin for anything that could help me, I found old photographs scattered across the floor. They were faded and yellowed, depicting scenes of people I didn't recognize, all with blank, staring eyes. One photograph showed a group of people standing around a similar wooden cross, their faces twisted in expressions of fear or anguish. The sight filled me with a deep sense of foreboding. The whispers outside grew louder and more frantic, and I could hear scratching at the door. It was as if the forest itself was trying to reach me, to pull me out into the darkness. I could feel the temperature inside the cabin drop, my breath visible in the freezing air. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that whatever was outside was not just a figment of my imagination, it was something real and dangerous. The cabin seemed to close in on me, its walls pressing in as the temperature continued to drop. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl, and I could feel the vibrations of the sound through the floorboards. I could no longer tell if it was the whispers or my own fear creating a distorted reality. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I searched frantically for a way out but found nothing useful. The windows were boarded up, and the door was still barricaded, but the sounds of the forest seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. I could hear the growls and whispers merging into a single, haunting melody that resonated with a deep, primal fear. In a moment of clarity, I realized that the whispers were not just random noises, they were a message, a plea from the souls trapped within the forest. They were trying to communicate something, but the message was lost amidst the chaos of the sound. I tried to listen carefully, to decipher the meaning of the whispers, but they remained an incoherent, maddening cacophony. As the night wore on, the sounds outside seemed to grow more intense, almost as if the forest itself was coming alive. The scratching at the door became more aggressive, and I could hear what sounded like voices arguing, their words unintelligible but filled with anger and desperation. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, and I could feel an oppressive force bearing down on me. I found a dusty old journal in the corner of the cabin, its pages brittle and yellowed. I opened it cautiously, hoping to find something that could shed light on the events unfolding around me. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing strange occurrences and sightings of shadowy figures in the forest. The final entry spoke of a ritual gone wrong, a summoning that had unleashed something malevolent into the woods. The journal mentioned a legend about a curse placed upon the forest, a dark entity bound to the land that preyed on those who ventured too close. The words seemed to echo the feelings of dread and fear that had gripped me since I arrived. The realization that I was trapped in a place with such a dark history filled me with a sense of hopelessness. The whispers outside grew more insistent, and the scratching at the door became almost frantic. It felt as if the forest itself was trying to tear its way into the cabin, eager to claim me as its next victim. I could no longer discern the source of the sounds. They were a chaotic mix of growls, whispers, and angry shouts. In a moment of desperation, I decided to attempt an escape. I moved the table away from the door, bracing myself for whatever lay outside. As I opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of decay and the sound of countless whispers. The forest outside was a dark, twisted maze of shadows and fog, the trees looming like dark sentinels. I stepped out into the darkness, trying to follow the path I had originally taken. The forest was even more disorienting at night, and the sounds of the whispers seemed to come from all directions. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and I stumbled frequently, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The feeling of being pursued was constant, a shadowy presence that seemed to follow my every move. As I continued through the forest, I stumbled upon the remnants of an old campsite. The area was littered with broken equipment and discarded supplies. There was a sense of abandonment, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry. The fire pit was cold and empty, but something about the scene felt deeply unsettling. Among the debris, I found a torn piece of fabric with a distinctive pattern, a pattern that matched the clothing I had seen near the wooden cross. The realization that someone else had been in this exact place, possibly under similar circumstances, sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if the forest was playing a cruel game, using these remnants to taunt me. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, their tone filled with desperation. I could feel the presence of something malevolent drawing closer, its influence palpable in the air. I tried to push forward, hoping to find an exit or a way to signal for help, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into its dark embrace. As the hours passed, fatigue began to take its toll. My steps grew slower, and my sense of direction became increasingly unreliable. The whispers had become a constant presence, their voices blending into a single, haunting chant. The darkness was absolute, and the forest seemed to close in around me, its oppressive silence broken only by the maddening whispers. I stumbled upon a small, hidden clearing, its eerie quietness a stark contrast to the chaos I had experienced. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient tree with gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. At the base of the tree was a carved symbol, worn and weathered but still visible. It looked like a crude representation of a face, its expression one of torment and despair. The whispers grew louder as I approached the tree, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow and anger emanating from it. The symbol seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I felt an almost irresistible urge to touch it. My hand trembled as I reached out, and as my fingers brushed against the carving, a jolt of cold energy surged through me. The whispers grew deafening, and I collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by a surge of fear and dread. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the forest floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost worse. I struggled to my feet, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The clearing was still there, but the ancient tree and the symbol seemed to have disappeared, as if they had never existed. The darkness of the forest was now even more oppressive, and the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I stumbled through the underbrush, my flashlight flickering erratically. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves felt like a potential threat, and the feeling of being pursued never left me. As I continued my frantic search for an escape, I noticed that the forest seemed to shift around me. The once familiar landmarks were now obscured by the darkness, and the path I had taken earlier was no longer recognizable. The feeling of hopelessness and despair grew stronger, and I began to fear that I might never find my way out. The hours dragged on, and I felt the weight of exhaustion and fear bearing down on me. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and my sense of time became distorted. I tried to keep track of my progress, but the twisted trees and shifting shadows made it impossible to tell if I was making any headway. At one point, I saw a faint light in the distance, a beacon of hope that I desperately clung to. I made my way toward it, pushing through the underbrush with renewed determination. As I got closer, the light revealed itself to be a small, abandoned cabin similar to the one I had found earlier. I approached the cabin cautiously, hoping it might provide some shelter or clues about how to escape. The door was ajar, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was similar to the previous cabin, with dusty furniture and cobwebs, but there was something different about this one. The air was colder, and the whispers seemed to be coming from within the walls. Inside the cabin, I found old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. I searched the cabin for anything useful, hoping to find a map or any sign of other people who might have been trapped here. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. In one corner of the cabin, I discovered an old journal similar to the one I had found earlier. The pages were filled with frantic notes and sketches of strange symbols. The writer had documented their own experiences with the forest, describing similar sounds and feelings of being hunted. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, with the writer's handwriting becoming increasingly erratic and distorted. The more I read, the more I realized that the forest had claimed many before me. The journal spoke of a dark entity that preyed on those who ventured too close, trapping them in a nightmarish reality. The words seemed to confirm my worst fears, and I felt a sense of impending doom settle over me. I knew I had to find a way out, but the darkness and isolation made it almost impossible to think clearly. As the night fell once again, I prepared to leave the cabin, my nerves on edge. The whispers had returned, their voices now a constant, dissonant chorus that filled the air. I felt as though the forest itself was closing in around me, its presence both malevolent and oppressive. I stepped outside, trying to follow the faint light that I had seen earlier. The forest was now a maze of shadows, and every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. I felt as though I was being watched from all sides, and the whispers seemed to grow louder with each step I took. The light in the distance turned out to be nothing more than a trick of the shadows, and I found myself back at the old wooden cross I had seen earlier. The cross was now almost completely obscured by the surrounding foliage, and the bloodstains had dried and darkened. The sight filled me with a deep sense of dread, and I realized that I was running out of options. In a moment of desperation, I decided to confront the source of the whispers directly. I followed the sounds, pushing through the underbrush until I reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a figure shrouded in darkness, its form shifting and contorting as if made of shadows. The figure seemed to be watching me, its presence both menacing and sorrowful. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent sentences that spoke of betrayal and suffering. The figure began to move toward me, its shadowy form merging with the darkness around it. I could feel an overwhelming sense of despair and hopelessness as it approached. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The figure's presence was suffocating, and I could feel its cold breath on my neck. In a final act of desperation, I turned and faced the figure, trying to muster the courage to confront whatever was tormenting me. The figure loomed over me, its shadowy form almost tangible in the darkness. The whispers had become a cacophony of voices, all speaking in unison and filling the air with a haunting melody. I could barely make out the figure's features, but its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with an unsettling, malevolent light. I tried to speak, to plead for mercy or understanding, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, and I felt a cold, icy grip tighten around my heart. The sensation was both physical and psychological, as if the figure was draining the very essence of my being. The forest seemed to close in around me, its shadows becoming more oppressive and menacing. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the weight of countless souls pressing down on me. I realized that I was not just facing one entity but a collective force of anguish and suffering that had been trapped within the forest for generations. As the figure's grip tightened, I felt a surge of cold energy coursing through me. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with an almost living energy, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. I could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmarish visions that had engulfed me. In a final act of defiance, I tried to break free from the figure's grasp, using every ounce of strength I had left. I managed to wrench myself away, stumbling backward into the underbrush. The figure's presence was still there, but its influence seemed to wane as I distanced myself from it. I ran through the forest, my mind racing with fear and exhaustion. The whispers had diminished, but the sense of being pursued never left me. I could still feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on me, and the feeling of hopelessness was almost overwhelming. As dawn approached, I stumbled upon a narrow path that seemed to lead out of the forest. I followed it with renewed hope, my movements slow and deliberate. The forest was still dark and foreboding, but the faint light of the morning sun provided a glimmer of hope. The path twisted and turned, but I managed to keep my bearings. The whispers had faded completely, replaced by the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. The forest began to change, its oppressive atmosphere giving way to a more serene and welcoming environment. Eventually, I emerged from the forest and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. The sight of the open sky and the sun's rays brought a sense of relief and exhaustion. I had escaped the forest, but the memory of the nightmarish experience would stay with me forever. Looking back, I realized how close I had come to losing everything. The forest had been a place of unimaginable darkness and terror, a place where malevolent forces preyed upon the unsuspecting. The whispers and the figure had been a manifestation of the forest's ancient and enduring evil. Though I had escaped, I knew that the forest would continue to claim those who ventured too close. The memory of the whispers and the shadowy figure would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had survived, but the experience had changed me forever, leaving me with a profound sense of dread and an awareness of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our understanding.
Story 3.
I had always chosen remote places for camping, believing they offered the ultimate escape from civilization's noise and distractions. This time, I ventured into a secluded forest in Virginia, where the trees loomed thick and the canopy above obscured the sky. It was a choice made on a whim, a break from the monotony of everyday life. I set up camp in a small clearing, the fire crackling warmly as I prepared my simple meal. But something felt off from the very beginning. The wind seemed to whisper through the branches, and the light from the fire cast unsettling shadows that danced just beyond the edge of the clearing. As night fell, the forest grew eerily silent, except for the wind's mournful howls. I sat alone by the fire, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far off, yet impossibly close. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I forced myself to ignore the creeping dread and focused on the warmth of the fire and the small comforts of my camping gear. But as the night deepened, the silence became oppressive, almost deafening. Strange sounds began to emerge from the darkness, footsteps that seemed to approach and then retreat, faint whispers that sounded disturbingly like human voices. I tried to calm my racing heart and rationalize the noises as the forest's natural symphony, but the unsettling sounds only grew louder. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to uncover the source of the sounds, I decided to investigate despite the rising fear in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the darkness, the beam of light barely piercing the thick underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long, gnarled shadows that twisted and writhed. The whispers grew clearer, and I could almost make out words, but they remained just out of reach, like a language I couldn't quite understand. Following the sounds, I stumbled upon a set of footprints leading away from my camp. They were old and partially obscured by fallen leaves, but they seemed to head deeper into the forest. The tracks led me to a narrow path that I hadn't noticed before, winding through the dense trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the path, each step echoing in the heavy silence. The path seemed to stretch on forever, and just when I thought I might turn back, I saw a faint light in the distance. The light guided me to an old, abandoned house that seemed out of place in the wilderness. Its windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling, giving it a sinister, decrepit appearance. I approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. As I stepped inside, the floor creaked under my weight, and I could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the place closing in around me. My flashlight revealed walls covered in strange, disturbing drawings and hastily scribbled notes about missing people. The notes on the walls were chilling. They detailed a series of disappearances, all connected to the very forest I was now trapped in. The drawings were even more disturbing, depicting grotesque rituals and twisted figures performing dark ceremonies. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the full extent of what I had stumbled upon. The house seemed to be a place of dark history, a place where people had once come to perform unspeakable acts. As I continued to explore, I found a journal tucked away in a corner, its pages yellowed and fragile. It belonged to someone named Charles, who had been a frequent visitor to this house. His writings spoke of an ancient evil lurking in the forest, a presence that demanded sacrifices. The more I read, the more I felt a chilling sense of doom, as if the very air around me was thick with the weight of forgotten horrors. Panic set in as I realized that my presence here was no coincidence. I had become a part of the forest's dark lore, and whatever was lurking in the shadows might not take kindly to my intrusion. The whispers grew louder, and the footsteps I had heard earlier now seemed to be closing in on me. I had to leave the house, return to my camp, and escape this nightmare before it was too late. I raced back through the forest, the darkness now feeling like a living entity, closing in around me with each passing second. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The whispers followed me, growing more insistent and threatening. I could hear faint screams echoing through the trees, adding to the cacophony of terror that surrounded me. Reaching my camp, I found it exactly as I had left it, but the sense of security I had earlier was gone. The fire had burned low, and the once comforting glow now seemed like a weak defense against the encroaching darkness. I tried to relight the fire, but my hands trembled too much to do so effectively. The footsteps from before were now unmistakably close, and I could hear something that wasn't human, moving around me. As the darkness pressed in, I could no longer tell if the sounds were coming from inside my head or if they were real. The forest seemed alive with malevolent energy, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight. I tried to think rationally, to come up with a plan to escape, but my thoughts were muddled with fear. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like a sign of something sinister approaching. In a desperate attempt to escape, I gathered my gear and decided to leave the forest altogether. I knew I couldn't stay in the camp any longer. The danger was too great. As I packed up quickly, the sounds around me grew more chaotic, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me there. The whispers turned into a roar of incomprehensible noise, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet. Just as I was about to leave, a chilling realization hit me. I had no idea which direction to go. The forest had twisted and turned, and I was now disoriented and lost. I knew I had to find a way out before the darkness consumed me entirely. I chose a direction that felt like it led away from the house, hoping against hope that it would lead me to safety. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The path was overgrown and treacherous, and I stumbled frequently, my flashlight flickering ominously. Every noise, every shadow, seemed to be an indication that something was hunting me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed on, determined to find my way out before it was too late. Desperation set in as I pushed through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out words that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. The shadows seemed to close in, and the trees appeared to lean in as if trying to trap me. I was losing my sense of direction, and the once familiar forest now felt like an alien landscape. In a final, frantic effort, I reached the edge of a small clearing that seemed to offer a brief respite from the oppressive darkness. I took a moment to catch my breath, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But as I looked around, I saw that the clearing was not as safe as it first appeared. Strange symbols were carved into the trees, and the ground was littered with remnants of something sinister, bones, fragments of clothing, and other disturbing objects. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was not alone, and whatever was in the forest was closing in on me. The footsteps that I had heard earlier were now unmistakable, coming from all directions. My breath came in ragged gasps as I prepared to make a final, desperate run for safety. I sprinted through the clearing, pushing through the undergrowth with every ounce of strength I had left. The forest seemed to close in behind me, the shadows stretching and shifting in the darkness. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting eerie beams of light that revealed glimpses of the forest's malevolent presence. Every sound seemed to be amplified, and the whispers grew more insistent, urging me to turn back. In my panic, I tripped over a hidden root and fell to the ground, scraping my hands and knees. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the terror I felt as I heard the footsteps drawing nearer. I scrambled to my feet, my mind clouded with fear and exhaustion. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the oppressive weight of its dark presence pressing against me. I pushed myself to run faster, my vision blurring as I fought to stay on course. The firelight of my campsite was now a distant memory, and the darkness of the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The whispers had grown into a cacophony of voices, each one blending into the other in a horrifying chorus of terror. I had no choice but to keep moving, driven by the primal instinct to survive. As the hours dragged on, the forest seemed to become a never-ending nightmare. My sense of time was distorted, and I could no longer tell how long I had been running. The whispers had turned into a constant, relentless drone, and the shadows seemed to be chasing me, their forms flickering just beyond my field of vision. My strength was waning, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. I stumbled upon a small cave hidden behind a cluster of trees. With no other options, I scrambled inside, hoping that it would provide some measure of safety. The cave was cold and damp, but it offered a brief respite from the relentless pursuit. I sat against the wall, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. The whispers outside the cave were still audible, but they seemed to be fading, as if the forest was losing interest in me. In the eerie silence of the cave, I tried to gather my thoughts and plan my next move. But the sense of impending doom never left me. I could feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on me, and the fear of what might be lurking just beyond the cave's entrance was almost overwhelming. I knew that I couldn't stay here forever, but the thought of venturing back into the darkness was almost more than I could bear. As the night wore on, I began to hear the sounds of movement outside the cave. The footsteps and whispers had returned, growing louder and more insistent. The cave, which had felt like a refuge, now seemed like a prison. My flashlight flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs, as if something, or someone, was circling the cave. The darkness outside seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, and every sound seemed to amplify my fear. I knew I had to leave the cave, but the thought of facing whatever was out there was paralyzing. I tried to steady my breathing and muster the courage to face the darkness once more. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and prepared to exit the cave. I had to find a way out of this forest and escape whatever was hunting me. As I stepped out into the darkness, the forest seemed to close in around me once more, the shadows stretching and shifting as if alive. The whispers were now a deafening roar, and the footsteps seemed to echo from every direction. I forced myself to move forward, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The forest seemed to conspire against me, with every step feeling like a struggle against an invisible force. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, creating nightmarish shapes that danced just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, overwhelming cacophony. My sense of direction was completely lost, and I felt as if I were wandering in circles. The forest had become an endless maze, with every turn leading me deeper into its dark heart. The fear and exhaustion were taking their toll, and I could feel my strength waning. I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find any sign of a way out. In the distance, I saw a faint light, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. I pushed myself towards it, driven by a desperate hope that it might be a way to escape the forest's clutches. But as I drew closer, the light seemed to flicker and waver, as if mocking my hopes. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in, their presence a suffocating weight that threatened to pull me under. The light turned out to be a false hope, a cruel illusion that led me deeper into the forest's clutches. My heart sank as I realized that the light was nothing more than a reflection of the moonlight on a pool of stagnant water. The forest around me seemed to close in tighter, the darkness becoming an almost tangible force. The whispers and footsteps grew louder, their presence almost overwhelming. I felt a deep sense of hopelessness as I continued to push through the darkness. The forest had become a nightmarish labyrinth, with every path leading me further into its depths. The fear that had initially driven me was now replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, and I could feel my strength slipping away. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible enemy, and I could feel my resolve starting to crumble. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I caught sight of something in the distance, an old, weather-beaten sign that read "Abandoned." It was a faint glimmer of recognition, and I felt a surge of hope. Maybe there was something in the abandoned area that could help me escape the forest's clutches. I pushed forward, my hope rekindled, even as the whispers grew louder and more insistent. The sign led me to a decrepit old building, its structure sagging and overgrown with vines. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, and the very presence of the building seemed to confirm the sense of foreboding that had been growing in my gut. I approached cautiously, my flashlight revealing the extent of the decay. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mold, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. I moved through the building, trying to find something that could help me or at least provide some shelter from the relentless darkness outside. The building was eerily silent, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The whispers from the forest had faded, replaced by a profound stillness that felt even more unsettling. As I explored the building, I found a series of old photographs and documents scattered across a dusty table. The photos depicted a family, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and despair. The documents were filled with strange symbols and writings, some of which seemed to match the markings I had seen earlier in the forest. It was clear that this place had a dark history, and the sense of unease only grew stronger. The photographs and documents offered no comfort, only deepening the mystery of the forest and its dark presence. The sense of dread was almost unbearable, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of madness. The whispers that had once been a distant background noise were now replaced by a haunting silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I could feel the weight of the forest's malevolence bearing down on me. I decided to leave the building and continue searching for a way out. As I stepped outside, I was confronted by a new and terrifying sight. The forest seemed to have changed. The trees had shifted, and the paths that had once been familiar were now twisted and unfamiliar. It was as if the forest itself had become a living, breathing entity, actively working to keep me trapped within its dark embrace. With my heart pounding, I pushed forward through the distorted forest. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, creating an ever-shifting landscape of terror. Each step felt like a struggle against an invisible force, and the fear of being completely lost in this nightmarish forest grew stronger. I could no longer tell if I was making progress or if I was simply wandering deeper into the forest's clutches. The feeling of being watched had never left me, and now it was accompanied by a sense of impending doom. The forest was alive with strange noises and shifting shadows, and every sound seemed to amplify my fear. The whispers had returned, their voices a constant, eerie murmur that seemed to echo through the trees. I was running on sheer adrenaline, my exhaustion and fear pushing me forward despite the growing sense of hopelessness. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I came across a small clearing. It was a brief respite from the oppressive darkness, but the relief was short-lived. In the center of the clearing stood an old, rotting tree with strange symbols carved into its bark. The sight of the symbols sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a surge of panic. Whatever was in the forest, it was connected to these symbols and the dark rituals I had uncovered. I tried to calm my racing heart and focus on finding a way out, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a haunting chorus of terror. The forest was closing in around me, and I could feel its malevolent presence pressing against me with every step I took. I sprinted away from the lantern, pushing through the underbrush with every ounce of strength I had left. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers were now a deafening roar, and the footsteps seemed to echo from every direction. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting eerie beams of light that revealed glimpses of the forest's malevolent presence. In my panic, I stumbled over a hidden root and fell to the ground. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the terror I felt as I heard the footsteps drawing nearer. I scrambled to my feet, my mind clouded with fear and exhaustion. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the oppressive weight of its dark presence pressing against me. As I stumbled through the darkness, I saw a faint light in the distance, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. I pushed myself towards it, driven by a desperate hope that it might be a way to escape the forest's clutches. But as I drew closer, the light seemed to flicker and waver, as if mocking my hopes. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in, their presence a suffocating weight that threatened to pull me under. The light revealed itself to be another cruel illusion, a reflection of the moonlight on a pool of stagnant water. The forest around me seemed to close in tighter, the darkness becoming an almost tangible force. The whispers and footsteps grew louder, their presence almost overwhelming. I felt a deep sense of hopelessness as I realized that I was completely lost, with no way out of the forest's clutches. In a final, desperate attempt, I made my way back to the old building. The sense of familiarity was a small comfort in the midst of the terror that surrounded me. I searched the building for any signs of escape, but it seemed to offer no solutions. The darkness outside grew deeper, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, as if mocking my efforts. I knew that I couldn't stay in the building forever, but the thought of facing the forest again was almost more than I could bear. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the whispers and footsteps were a constant, terrifying presence. I was trapped in a nightmarish labyrinth, with no hope of escape and no way to understand the dark forces that held me captive. The fear and exhaustion had reached a breaking point, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. The forest had become an inescapable prison, and the dark forces that dwelled within seemed to be closing in around me. The whispers had become a maddening cacophony, and the footsteps were now a constant, oppressive presence. I felt a deep sense of despair as I realized that I was completely lost, with no way out of the forest's clutches. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the shadows twisted and writhed in a nightmarish dance. The whispers and footsteps were a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that surrounded me, and I could feel my strength waning. As I sat in the darkness, my mind clouded by fear and exhaustion, I felt a chilling realization: the forest was not just a physical place, but a living, breathing entity that fed on my fear. The whispers and footsteps were not just illusions but manifestations of the forest's dark power. I was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, with no way to escape and no hope of salvation. The forest seemed to sense my despair and fed off it, its darkness growing even more oppressive. The whispers were now a deafening roar, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist with a malevolent energy. I felt as if the forest was closing in around me, its dark presence suffocating and inescapable. I had no choice but to confront the darkness head-on. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward, driven by a desperate hope that there might still be a way out. But as I pushed through the underbrush, I could feel the forest's malevolent presence growing stronger, its darkness pressing in from all sides. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of escape. The whispers grew louder, their voices a maddening cacophony that seemed to echo through the trees. The shadows twisted and writhed, creating nightmarish shapes that danced just beyond the edge of my vision. The fear and exhaustion had reached a breaking point, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. In the final moments of my ordeal, I came to a harrowing realization: the forest was not just a place, but a manifestation of my deepest fears and anxieties. The darkness that surrounded me was not external but internal, a reflection of the terror that had taken root within me. The whispers and footsteps were not real, but projections of my own fears. With this realization came a profound sense of despair. I was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, with no way to escape the darkness that had consumed me. The forest had become a reflection of my own mind, a place where my fears and anxieties had taken physical form. I was lost, both in the forest and within myself. As I succumbed to the darkness, I felt a sense of finality. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escape from the nightmarish realm that had become my prison. The whispers and footsteps faded into an eerie silence, and the shadows closed in around me, pulling me into the void. The darkness had won, and I was left alone in the heart of the forest, a prisoner of my own fears and despair.